Howdy everyone, and welcome back to Harp and Guitar, People and Music. So Whiskey here again today, and for this video I would like to continue to talk about some of my blues recommendations, artists or specific recordings that I would recommend out of my private collection of certain songs, recordings, or artists that if you can get your hands on these fellows, it would definitely be worth your time to give it a listen and explore a little further. So for today, as you can see, I want to kick things off here with my man, Mr. Son House. And Son House was very influential in the world of blues, especially in terms of freeform songwriting, and as well as his masterful and very highly accomplished guitar playing style. You can see here he played on a National Steel guitar with a resonator, and he played with a slide. And Son House was a fantastic slide player and a very passionate blues singer. He had a very powerful and strong voice, deeply rooted in gospel and in the church in his young life. And this is highly reflective in the way that he sang his songs and the energy that he put into his guitar playing. Now, Son House was a very interesting character because he did a lot of really great recordings early in his career, starting in the early 1930s right through until the mid-1940s. And then he just sort of seemingly vanished. And it wasn't until the early to mid-1960s when he was so-called, quote, rediscovered by a bunch of blues folklorists and researchers. And they found Son House no longer living in the South, in Mississippi or in the Tennessee area, but he had moved up to Rochester, New York, and was working for the railroads as a porter. Apparently, as the story goes, he felt so sinful and so remorseful about the blues, or the devil's music, that he was singing. Again, he was brought up in the church, and he always had this sort of guilt and this conflict within himself as being a man of God, but singing the music of the devil. And because in his early years he did pal around with the likes of Robert Johnson and Tommy Johnson and Charlie Patton, and he had seen all of these friends of his die, and more often than not in violent and mysterious ways. So as a result of this guilt and this sort of fear that, oh God, I might be next for singing this devil's music kind of thing, he put his guitar down and he stopped in the 40s. And like I said, it wasn't until the mid-60s when he was rediscovered and sort of coaxed back into the music scene by some of these blues writers and researchers. And then he sort of began to re-emerge as an influential blues artist now in the 60s, and in turn started to influence a whole new generation of blues and folk musicians. Now, another very influential guitarist and singer of the blues, especially in the 30s and 40s, but up to and including the mid-50s, was Big Bill Broonzy. Big Bill Broonzy was a masterful guitar player, and he eventually ended up touring not only the southern United States, but the entire continent of North America as a whole, and did some stints in the UK and in Europe in the 50s. In fact, Big Bill was one of the first to tour Europe as a blues musician. And Big Bill had a very extensive and long career. As I mentioned, he recorded from the 30s right through up to and including the mid to late 50s, and he literally recorded hundreds and hundreds of songs, and in several different blues styles as well. He did some sort of early experimental recordings as a rhythm and blues artist in Chicago, but his bread and butter really was a fantastic finger-picking style of guitar playing, more deeply rooted in a sort of a southern blues roots and folk music kind of a style. But he was very influential on many guitar players that would come for decades in the future. One of those, of course, was everybody's favorite, Mr. Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters was not only influenced by Big Bill, but by Son House as well. In fact, Muddy is quoted on film and in audio as saying that he learned many of the songs that he played, and he learned the style of playing with a slide on his finger from Son House. Now, the other great thing about Muddy Waters, much like Son House and Big Bill, was that Muddy had a huge and very extensive recording career, as you can see here from this album, which is an album of his very first recordings with the Library of Congress in 1941 and 1942. And this was before Muddy Waters was Muddy Waters. He was still going by his original given name of McGinley Morganfield at the time. But already at this early stage of Muddy's career, he was already quite well established as a great blues singer, or guitar picker, as he was called. And the other great thing about Muddy, which is very well known by most of us here in sort of that have any interest in the blues at all, is that Muddy is known as the bridge of the blues. He took some of those original old traditional blues songs from the 20s and the 30s that he learned from the previous generation, and he took those same songs with him when he moved up to Chicago in the 40s and electrified and started playing a lot of these traditional older songs on electric guitar in Chicago. Now, the reason he had to do this, of course, was because Chicago was a big city and it was a lot noisier and more crowded than some of the smaller rural areas that he was used to playing in the South. Some of these smaller juke joints that would maybe only hold 100 people or 200 people at the most. But when playing in Chicago in some of these larger juke joints and eventually Chicago blues clubs, where there are hundreds and hundreds of people, in order to be heard above the din of the crowd and the noise and the merrymaking, you had to electrify your music. And Muddy was one of the first to successfully do this and really parlay this into sort of a new level of his career. So Muddy was very, very influential in that sense. And again, because he had such a huge recording history from the early 40s right through to the late 80s, he appears on lots of different records. He toured the world. So you'll find live albums of Muddy Waters where you really get the essence of his music. As you can see from a lot of the photos on these covers, he was a very passionate and soulful singer. He had a very powerful voice, and he was a ripping slide guitar player. I mean, he basically took the fundamentals of slide guitar on acoustic guitar and took it to the next level, and was able to play some really fantastic sort of slashing riffs with that slide on an electric guitar. And Muddy, as well as Big Bill, and Son House for that matter, also toured Europe and parts of UK, and in fact did quite a few extensive recordings in London, as you can see here by the Muddy Waters London Sessions, which is a great album, and I would highly recommend this one specifically as well. It has a lot of great guest artists that back up Muddy Waters. And from what I understand, when these fellas caught wind that Muddy was going to be in town recording, they jumped at the opportunity to take part in these recordings. You know, fellas like Rory Gallagher, who's a fine blues guitarist in his own right, Rick Gretsch, and of course Steve Winwood on keyboards. So these fellas admired Muddy for obvious reasons, and like I said, jumped on the opportunity to do some recording in London with the great Muddy Waters. Now, another fantastic blues guitar player, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Mr. John Lee Hooker, a fantastic original blues guitarist and quite a great singer in his own right, a very deep and sort of a haunting way of singing, a very soulful and bluesy style of voice. And his guitar playing is very original and almost incomparable, really, because it's so unique in its stylings. Now, as you may guess, John Lee Hooker, like most of the bluesmen of this time period, you know, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even early 60s. Obviously, John Lee comes from the South. He's a Mississippi man. But what made John Lee a little different from a lot of the other fellows like Big Bill and Muddy Waters was John Lee didn't immediately move right up to Chicago, straight up into Chicago from the South. He actually made a brief stop in St. Louis before finally landing in Detroit. And this is where John Lee made many of his recordings and, sort of spent the major part of his career, was based out of Detroit. And I think that may have a lot to contribute to the style of his music, very hard-driving, almost influenced by the industrial machinery and the industrial manner of the economy in around Detroit in the 40s and 50s. And it affected his music in the sense that it made his music very hard-driving and very sort of industrial sounding as well, very, very rough and gruff, but still somehow very refined. And again, much like Muddy, John Lee Hooker has quite an extensive library because he recorded, as I mentioned, from the starting in the 40s right through into the 2000s when he passed away. So there's quite a large library of material out there available for you. And, when it comes to John Lee Hooker, much like Muddy, anything you can get your hands on is going to be quality stuff. John Lee was a fantastic guitar player, as I mentioned, a great singer as well, a very original voice. And as a result, he was very sought after by other artists. They wanted to perform with John Lee Hooker. And that's where you come into situations where John Lee, through the 80s and 90s, did a lot of duets or appeared as guests on other albums of other artists. For example, Bonnie Raitt, Van Morrison, and Canned Heat. This album here, Hooker and Heat, is a fantastic example of that. John Lee Hooker with Canned Heat. It's a live album, and they get in some grooves on here where you have songs that are 6, 7, 8 minutes long because the fellas get into such a groove in there. You could tell they're really jazzed about playing with John Lee Hooker. And John Lee Hooker is jazzed about playing with some of these new younger fellows as well. So now, speaking again of great guitarists and moving from Detroit up into Chicago, I'd like to talk a little bit about Magic Sam. Magic Sam's a little bit more obscure and not maybe quite as well known as some other guitarists that were just as accomplished as Magic Sam. His name is maybe not as noticeable as fellows like Otis Rush or Buddy Guy, but his playing is almost unsurpassed. Really, I hold him in almost as high regard as Buddy Guy himself, who I consider to be the greatest blues guitar player of all time. Exception maybe being B.B. King. But Magic Sam is right up there. Magic Sam had a fantastic career. He started off once again in the late 40s, early 50s, but really came into his own in the late 50s, early 60s, and really helped to develop the Chicago blues sound, that sort of South Side sound. And the nice thing about Magic Sam's playing was that he was able to do a lot of really tasty technical licks, but at the same time he could sort of have an easygoing way about the way that he played his guitar. And he also had a very powerful and soulful voice. Basically, the term blues soul or soul blues was sort of coined in an attempt to try to categorize the type of blues that Magic Sam was performing. Now, speaking of Magic Sam and the West Side and South Side Chicago blues sound, I of course have to mention my main man here, Mr. Buddy Guy. Buddy Guy is also sort of a bridge artist of sorts, much like Muddy Waters. And as I mentioned, how Muddy bridged the gap between acoustic blues in the South and electric blues in Chicago, and sort of was basically the main catalyst for the invention of what is now currently Chicago blues. Buddy Guy is right up there, but his legacy, or his claim to fame, is he's the bridge between blues and blues rock. And Buddy Guy's guitar playing stylings were very, very influenced by a lot of the earlier generations, such as Son House and Muddy Waters and Big Bill. But the other thing about Buddy Guy is that he also had a great relationship with a bunch of the early rock and roll fellas. And as case in point, through the early and mid-70s, Buddy Guy, along with his musical partner at the time, harmonica player Junior Wells, Buddy Guy and Junior Wells as a duo, very, very often through the 70s, opened for the Rolling Stones as the Rolling Stones toured the country and the world. So that's some pretty high praise right there. Now, Buddy Guy's style of guitar playing is peppered with all kinds of flourishes up and down the fretboard. And he's masterful, once again, at having these quick, tasty licks that are technically proficient, but somehow still have a very easy sort of feeling to them. And I think that, in part, is because his early career is also rooted in the South. He started off playing in southern juke joints before moving up to Chicago. So he was very deeply immersed in that sort of folk music style of the blues in the South. So very highly recommend anything you can get your grubby paws on that has Buddy Guy in the title, especially his chess recordings, of course. But he did some great work with Vanguard as well, and Silvertone later in his career. And the nice thing about Buddy is he's still touring. He's still around. He's still a very powerful singer and powerful, fantastic guitar player. Like I said, in my opinion, that he's the best blues guitarist of all time. And you can still see Buddy live. So if he comes to your town or your city and you have the opportunity to go and check him out, I would highly recommend seeing a Buddy Guy show. He's very intelligent. He gives you a bit of blues history. He plays a lot of great songs, and he tells a lot of great stories about artists that he's played with and people that he's met through the years, and some of the artists that have influenced him in his past. And one last quick thing to note here with Buddy Guy was on Muddy Waters' deathbed, Buddy Guy was at his side. He greatly admired Muddy Waters and considered him a personal friend and a mentor. And while Muddy was in his deathbed, and Buddy paid him a visit, Muddy specifically told Buddy Guy, "You need to keep these blues alive." And Buddy took this very seriously and has basically become the de facto ambassador of the blues, and is trying to carry on the traditions of not only the roots of the blues in the South, but the Chicago blues stylings of himself and many of the artists that came before him. He was very, very heavily influenced by Muddy Waters, so much so that they formed a very, very strong friendship. Now, another fellow here that was very, very strongly influenced by Muddy Waters, and a fantastic blues player, guitar player in his own right, is Johnny Winter. Now, Johnny Winter has a little bit of a different story. He comes from the South, but he's a Texas bluesman. And Johnny Winter has a reputation of being one of the fastest blues players in the business. He's got the fastest fingers in blues, is the often quoted tagline about Johnny Winter. A very proficient and technically able guitar player, but again, deeply rooted in the feeling or the soulfulness of the blues. And again, very heavily influenced by Muddy Waters. As a matter of fact, Johnny Winter did a bunch of recordings with Muddy through the late 70s and early 80s, and was a major contributor to producing a lot of Muddy Waters' later albums. Johnny Winter is a very gifted, not only singer and guitar player, but very accomplished behind the mixing board in the studios as well. And this really shows in a lot of the productions and recordings that Muddy Waters did with Johnny at the helm. So as I mentioned, these are some of the essential blues recordings that I would recommend. These are just a few examples of some of the fantastic blues guitarists that have appeared over the last, 5 or 6 decades or so. Some of the guys, like I said, that I would recommend for their fantastic guitar playing, their soulful and powerful voices, and also their influence on the generations that were to follow in the blues. So I think that's going to do it for Old Whiskey here today. I want to thank you once again for coming by Harp and Guitar, People in Music, and checking us out. I'd also like to remind you that if you found this interesting, let me know what you think. And please don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel here. So I hope everyone has a good one, and we'll talk to you again real soon. And thanks again for stopping by. We'll talk to you again later. Thanks a lot. Take care now. Bye-bye.